stop that. The UFA are our big rivals, so I had to correct that. Anyway, I'm Kartik, and I will be presenting work on our AI mix system, which was basically a system that we dreamt up, where we wanted to bring automated planners into this problem of crowdsourced planning, and I'll explain what that is. This is work by Lydia Manikonda and Tathagata Chakrabarti, and a couple of others at ASU. So, just to give you an idea of the problem that we were trying to attack, crowdsourcing is actually a very popular problem. It's been around for a while, but it's actually caught a lot of people's imagination of late. And essentially, it's the process of obtaining ideas and needed service, maybe plans, from a group of humans, from a crowd of people. And the difference being that this crowd of people need not necessarily be experts in what they're doing. It's just that they have some cycles to spare. And so it's basically a portmanteau of crowd and outsourcing. So you're outsourcing your task, whatever it may be, to a group of people. And one very good example of crowdsourcing is, or crowdsourced planning, is this problem of travel planning. So now there are lots of websites, lots of apps, which will essentially let you go in and enter a text description of something that you need to do. So suppose you're flying to Quebec City for iaaai, and you don't really know anything about Quebec City, but you don't really have the cycles to make a plan, or a travel plan or a tour plan for yourself. You can go and enter the specifics of what you want to do, with however much detail you want to enter. It can be a sentence, it can be 2 paragraphs, whatever it is. And you can put it in, and there will be these websites or these apps will connect you with a crowd of people who will actually give you suggestions. So some of these suggestions, so this example that we worked on initially was based in New York City, which is probably one of the most visited destinations in the US, if not in the world. And essentially these are the kinds of suggestions that you might get from users. So, these are some popular attractions in New York City. Maybe they're telling you a little bit more about what to do in those attractions. Maybe they're marking them on a map and so on. So, this is essentially the travel planning problem for crowdsourcing. And I want to define a couple of roles that we will come back to again and again in this talk, and which are important. The first one is this notion of a requester. Okay, and the requester is essentially a human. Think of the requester as you. So if you wanted a travel plan to be made for yourself, you would be the requester, and you have some desired goals. So maybe you want to look around Quebec City, you want to eat in some nice places, do some sightseeing, maybe do some shopping and so on, right? Maybe do some things that are unique to Canada and so on. So you have some goals, you have some preferences. So maybe you would prefer things that were less expensive if you're a student, right, and you're here on a travel run. Maybe you would prefer to stay in really nice hotels if you're faculty. So there are some preferences which my advisor is right here, by the way. But there are some preferences which may be expressed, but more often than not, they're not really expressed. They're in your head, but they don't really come out. And the most important part of this is that all of these, you're more likely than not to engage with an app or with a website when you can specify these in as close to natural language as possible, right? So you don't want to put any restrictions on your users that you must use the following format, or you must enter it in the following way and so on. And unfortunately, it would be very nice if we got all of this input in exactly these formats, but unfortunately what you actually tend to end up getting as the creator of an app or the creator of a service is something like this. So you get a mash of all of these things together, usually in a paragraph in full natural language, and you get a really short description. So something like, what must I do, eat and see in NYC? I've been there before, but I need suggestions on new things to do. Okay. Now there's not really a lot of information in there that an automated system can really use, but that's all we have to go on. That's all we can start our planning with. So the first important role is that of the requester. I want you to keep that in mind. The second one obviously is the crowd, since we're talking about crowdsourcing. So where are all your ideas coming from? Who is doing the planning for you? So the crowd is also, it's a human role. It's made up of a number of humans. It's a collection of humans now. So there are a couple of things that the crowd can actually do. They can break your task down into action items. So if you had a task request, like the thing that I showed you in the previous slide, which is not really all that detailed, right? It's a very high level description of what they want to do. Maybe you want the humans first to break it down into particular action items. So if I have a day in New York, maybe I want to eat in a couple of good restaurants. Maybe I want to give them suggestions on nightlife, maybe visit some museums because there's lots of them in New York and so on. So that's one thing that the crowd can do. They can break it down into sub-goals. They can also provide specific suggestions in aid of some of those sub-goals. So if you look at the restaurants and food sub-goal, for example, maybe they'll suggest specific restaurants that you want to visit. And again, this is information that's coming from the crowd. They don't necessarily have to be experts. Instead of Magnolia Bakery, they could easily suggest Burger King. There's nothing to stop them from doing. The third thing that they could do is they could actually critique each other's actions. Now this is where having a group of people, having a crowd is really powerful, because if you have a group of people and you have multiple iterations, it's possible that you can actually improve the quality of your solution. So if somebody suggests something like Katz's Deli, but there's something about it that's not actually all that nice or all that savory, then somebody in the next round can actually come in and say maybe it's overhyped, maybe it's overpriced, and so on. So that's one of the good things about having lots of users contributing towards your final plan. And finally, they can actually generate an actionable plan. Now what I mean by an actionable plan is an executable plan. All of these suggestions are useless if you can't order them and give them back to your customer and say that here's what we suggest you do. Here's the final product of whatever you were looking for. So that's the second role, that's the crowd. And the crowdsourced planning problem that we are trying to solve essentially looks like this, where you have the requester who I defined and you have the crowd, and they both are essentially interacting via this common interface. We call it the collaborative blackboard. You can think of it as a collaborative interface into which all of the users involved in this process have both reading and writing rights. Okay, so the requester can basically input their specification, their goals, preferences, and so on, and it can be in either an unstructured format or a structured format. And similarly, the crowd can input their suggestions. They can collaborate with each other. So this cuts down some of the need for communication within the crowd, because if everybody's sharing the same interface, then if I make edits to it, everybody else is able to see my edits, and then they're able to critique my edits, comment on those, and so on. So this essentially is the crowdsourced planning problem. And the question that we were trying to address in a preliminary way, but via a deployed application, was this, that is it possible to improve this process, this crowdsourced planning process, by bringing in automated techniques, and specifically automated planning, because this problem has a lot of the components of a planning problem. And so essentially what would happen there is you would try to interject a planner into this process, and you would try to see if you can make it more efficient, if you can make it more cost effective, get plans of better quality perhaps, and so on. So before you actually sort of impose a planner almost on this process, you need to actually think about what are the things that the planner can do for me, right? So what are the roles of an automated planner? So the first thing that the automated planner could do, remember I talked about sub-goals, decomposing higher level goals into their constituent sub-goals. So that's one thing that a planner could ostensibly do for you. So if you have, say, a suggestion on going to Magnolia Bakery, then one obvious thing that comes up is how do you actually get there? How do you get to a place that was suggested in your plan? Or, what are the hours that a certain place is open? So if that place was suggested as a place in your plan, are there specific hours that you need to visit this place? So that's one thing you can, steer the crowd towards coming up with sub-goals for these things. The next thing that your system can do, being an automated system, is it can do constraint checking, and automated systems are really good at this, and they scale really well, right? Because if you have humans who are trying to do constraint checking, maybe they'll keep up with you if you have 5 or 10 suggestions, but then once you start scaling up, you have 50, 100 suggestions, humans are going to let go, especially if it's a distributed crowd, right? But automated systems, if they can check one constraint correctly, they will do it no matter what the size of the data, and they will not err there. So you can do constraint checking. And finally, using the planner, you can also come up with a schedule, because that's an important part of this travel planning problem. So no matter how many suggestions you have, if you don't schedule it into an actionable plan, into an actionable schedule, it's kind of pointless. So automated systems are really good at this also. We've had years of research on this. So these are some of the roles that the planner can play. These are the 3 that we specifically looked at. And before the planner can actually do this, we need to talk about this question of the models that the planner is going to use, right? Because this is a burning question in a lot of planning research, which is that we have fast planning algorithms, but then they're useless if you don't have a good model of your application. And the model essentially is made up of 2 things. One is the dynamics of the domain, right? So if it's a travel planning domain, maybe you have actions like visiting a place, how to get to a place, entry into a place, and so on and so forth. And then you also have preferences associated with them. So, maybe it's better to go to a certain restaurant than it is to a certain other restaurant, and so on. These are all specific to the domain that you're handling, but it's not clear that your planner will have complete information about this upfront. So, like I said, there are possibilities about these models. So the first one is that you assume that your planner comes with a full model, right? In which case the planner can actually generate plans by itself. You don't need the humans, right? Humans are always, it's a trouble to actually deal with humans and the crowd. So if you had a planner that had a full model, the crowd's just too expensive and cumbersome to deal with. You would just have the planner generated. But that's not a realistic assumption. In no application, and especially not in things like travel planning, will your planner actually come with a full model. The opposite end of that is that you assume your planner has no knowledge, it has no model. But then that's pointless. I wouldn't be here talking to you because the planner has no role there, right? You just have to do the best you can with humans. The really interesting case is when the planner has a partial model, which is when you try to come up with what is the best thing that the planner can do. What are the things that you can make take full advantage of. And this is likely to be the most likely scenario in real world problems, right? So travel planning, but a bunch of other problems as well. And this connects neatly to this concept of model-led planning. So if you have models that are not complete, but they're not completely bad either, how can you use the knowledge in those models to come up with the best plans that you can? So I'll explain that in the coming slides. So there are two main challenges that we had to consider so remember this picture that I showed you. What we were trying to do was we were trying to push this planner into this process, right? So there are a couple of things that are obvious. The first thing is that the planner needs to figure out what is going on here, right? So the planner is an automated system. You have one human here and a group of humans who are ostensibly communicating in full natural language. So your automated system actually needs to figure out what is it that is going on right now. So it has to understand the goal of this requester, right? And it also has to understand that the plan that the crowd is coming up with. So this is probably in a completely unstructured format. If you're lucky, maybe it's in a semi-structured format, right? But the planner still has to figure out what they're saying to each other and how they're solving the problem. And there is a mismatch here. And again, like I said, the spectrum of input can span all the way from completely unstructured to somewhat semi-structured, and fully structured input is kind of a pipe dream. You're not going to get that in a real application, especially if you're dealing with real people, maybe a real app or a deployed website and so on. You're never going to have fully structured knowledge. So the interpretation challenge, there are a couple of ways to deal with that. The first one is that you can force structure, right? You can be grumpy and say that, oh, planners are the best things in the world. You guys must give me input in forms that the planner will understand, right? But then very soon you're going to drive away even the few humans who are willing to give you some information. Because if you restrict the knowledge that humans can give you, then you're not going to get that much knowledge. And one of the aims of crowdsourcing is to get as much knowledge as possible from the crowd. The other thing you can do is you can send a message to the humans that you guys use any representation that you're comfortable with. Maybe it's full natural language, right? Maybe you're just typing text without any format or without any structure. You can use full natural language, and we will try to extract as much as we can from that. So we, being the planner, we will try to extract actions and maybe sub goals and other important constraints maybe from the input that you generate. But there are no constraints on what you can give us. Give us all the information that you can think of, right? And you basically validate this against some partial model of the domain that you have. So maybe for example, that in a travel planning domain, if you look at verbs are likely to be activities. They're likely to be actions that you are suggesting to people. So if you say things like, go to a certain place or swim in this certain lake or whatever it is, those are actions. And nouns are more likely to correspond to places or suggestions for things to do, right? So if you say something like, go to the Gettysburg Memorial, that's likely to be a place that you want to go to. So that's the partial model that I'm talking about. And then you iteratively refine the plan that you're coming up with. Remember, because I said there's a group of humans, there's a crowd of humans who are helping you do this planning. So that's the dealing with the interpretation challenge, and I'll talk about that a little bit in the coming slides. The second big challenge obviously is steering. So steering is sort of the complementary problem of interpretation. So steering is this direction. So once the planner has understood what's going on in this process, how does the planner actually impose itself on the process? So what kinds of suggestions can the planner throw out, and what kinds of guidance can the planner give to the crowd that's planning? So it's a problem of pushing the crowd towards producing a plan in a collaborative manner, in an iterative manner, right? And you have to obviously do this in the presence of the partial domain model that I talked about, partial models of the world, and it's an iterative process. So again, here you have a spectrum of models that you're dealing with. You could have possibly a very, very shallow model, so there's not really that much information or structure in your model. So maybe you can only do basic things like constraint checking, arithmetic checking, and there's actually been work in human computation on doing that sort of thing. In fact, this work, the MOBI system by Hao-Chi Xiang et al., that was one of the first systems to look at this problem of crowdsourcing in the context of automation, and we are sort of trying to take their work to the next logical step. All the way to you may have some approximate notion of your models, in which case you can do things like generating sub-goals from your current plan and so on. So that's the second challenge of steering. And again, as with interpretation, there are a couple of ways of handling this steering problem as well. So one way is obviously you can come up with critiques. Your planner can generate constructive critiques of the current planning process, of the ongoing planning process. So it can participate in the refinement of the plan, it can generate some goals for some of the activities. So suppose your plan had certain activities saying, go and visit the Museum of Modern Art, right? So maybe one of the sub goals could be, how do you get to the Museum of Modern Art, right? And these things can actually be automated. I'll show you how in our interface. So there's a couple of things that you can do with constructive critiquing. You can also do constraint checking. This is the thing that I was talking about earlier, where I said, if you have an automated system, one of the first things you must make it do is make it do constraint checking, because humans are not good at this, and automated systems are really good. So you can make it check quantitative constraints on your plan. So maybe your requester said, I cannot spend more than X amount. Maybe I can't spend more than $200, or I cannot spend more than 1 day. I have a conference to get back to, and things like that, right? So those are constraints that can be enforced by your planner, and you can choose the best set of activities to schedule that fulfill that constraint. So I'm going to talk about all of this. So this was an overview of the challenges that are present in bringing automated techniques to the crowdsourced planning problem. So I'm going to talk about this AI mix system, which is our first attempt at bringing some of this theory together and seeing how it works. AI mix stands for Automated Improvement of Mixed Initiative Experiences. Now obviously this is a hat tip to the work on mixed initiative planning from the 80s and the early 90s that went on in automated planning. Except that I think some of you who were present in Rao's talk today probably heard this, where the difference is that back in the day, mixed initiative planning used to be that planners had to live sort of in the land of humans. So planners had to deal with humans coming in and messing around with their search and with their planning process and so on. But now it's reversed. It's sort of your it's almost like your planner has to understand what the humans are doing now, and your planner has to give them suggestions. So it's still mixed initiative planning, but from a slightly different perspective. And the system that we designed, it works on multiple platforms. So we started out with Amazon's MTurk platform, the Mechanical Turk, because that is one of the biggest crowdsourcing marketplaces. It's a very good place to find Turkers or crowd workers. But then we also extended it to Google's App Engine, because one of the problems with MTurk is that you have to be registered with Amazon with a credit card and all of that. So if I wanted to give you guys a demo, right, and we have demoed this at different conferences, it's just easier to have it on Google's App Engine. You can put it on a website and you can have multiple people in different locations play with it. So we have it deployed on multiple platforms. The input, I showed you an example of the kind of input we take. It's just full natural language from the requester, and there are certain semi-structured parts that I'll come to. If the requester feels like giving us that semi-structured information, we're happy to accept that. And there's two kinds of outputs from this system. There's a set of suggestions made by the crowd for the requester to do. So these are a set of activity suggestions, and these activity suggestions are all scheduled into a final plan that can be executed. So remember, there may be more activity suggestions than are included in the final plan, but that's always a good thing. You're trying to come up with the best plan given the constraints that the requester has given you. So this is a schematic of the AI mix system. You've already seen this. The new things are the interpretation here and the steering here that are being handled. And this is the interface of the system. So what we have essentially, I'll run through all of these quickly, but you should notice that this was the one that was deployed on Amazon's MTurk. So this is exactly what the crowd worker would see when they logged in. So you guys are seeing exactly what the crowd workers see when they log in. So the first component is obviously some instructions for the crowd workers on what they can do. So the two main things are that they can suggest a new activity and they can critique the existing activities in the interface. The next important thing to look at is the request from the requester. Now this is slightly more detailed than the example I gave you. If you look at it, it has two components. One is a full text component where the requester said I'm going to New York City for for only a day in a month and so on and so forth. And then there's also a semi-structured part where they've given us some sort of constraints on what they would like to do. So this is a combination of preferences plus constraints. So maybe a museum to visit, that's a preference. Around 2 hours maximum, that's a constraint on time now, and so on. So this is a collection of those things. There's also, if you notice, a set of to-do tags. Now these to-do tags are generated either by the crowd or by the planner in an automated fashion. So we put all of them in the same place because ultimately the goal is to help the next round of workers who come in to sort of make a better version of the plan, to iteratively refine the plan. So these are some suggestions on to-do tags. And there's also the current list of existing activities. So there are only 2 suggestions right now. So we took the screenshot, when the process had just started. So 2 workers have come in and put in some suggestions now, and they've tagged it with the activities that they're supposed to correspond to. And other workers can come in and either add new ones, or they can actually critique these activities. And finally, we also have a map, so workers can kind of zoom in, check the feasibility of getting from a place to a certain other place, and so on. I'll talk about that a little bit in future work. So adding in activities, like I said, crowd workers can provide any number of activity suggestions, and all activities are in service of a to-do tag, okay? So they satisfy a to-do tag, maybe #shop, #visit, #restaurant, and so on, right? And after the submission, the planner actually checks for constraint violations, and it generates some sub-goals if they're applicable, and then the process continues. So it's an iterative process essentially. And this is the interface to add a new activity. The crowd worker clicks a button, and then they have some fields where they can enter these things. They can choose to enter as many of these as possible. None of these are required fields really, because again, like I said, it's an iterative process. We're hoping that other workers who come after them will improve on the process. And the planner itself, for sub-goal generation, it uses a very high-level PDDL action model. Now, we didn't encode too much knowledge in this. In fact, it's very high-level to the level of having actions such as visit, lunch, shop, and so on. So, it's not specific to a city, it's not specific to any particular task, it's just that it's the tour planning domain, so we know that there might be some generic preconditions and so on. So, here's an example of one of these, and anytime the planner sees an action that may correspond to visiting some place, it will automatically pop up these sub-goals to be satisfied by the next round of workers and so on. You can also, so this is an example of a sub-goal. So when they said Manhattan, walk near the NYPL, there's immediately this thing that's popped up that says, how do I get to Manhattan, right? So that's one of the sub-goals that the planner automatically popped up. You can also have critiques. So you can have critiques from the humans, from the crowd. So the crowd can come in and say, I give you an example, they can say, oh, you know what, Magnolia Bakery is just overpriced. You don't really want to go there. Or you can have automated critiques, which are more on the nature of constraint critiques, constraint violations from the planner itself. And both of them are resolved again by future crowd workers. And the system actually continues until there are no more unresolved critiques or unresolved alerts. That's the stopping condition essentially. And so this is, I'm just going to run quickly through this. This is how you enter the critiques. There are 2 kinds. You can enter for a particular suggestion, or you can enter ordering constraints. Say, I want to have lunch before I do touristy things. Okay, so things like that. These can be entered by the crowd. And we took all of these together, and then we generated a schedule using answer set programming. We used ASP, we used Klingo, I think. Purely because it actually it satisfies some constraints that were important to us in the tour planning domain. You could imagine plugging in your favorite scheduling algorithm or your favorite planner here. In fact, I think we should be able to do this. It's just that we used ASP for this particular thing. Here are some constraints that were specific to the travel planning domain. And we conducted some, like I said, some preliminary experiments by deploying this on Amazon's mTurk. And we tried this on travel planning scenarios for 6 cities, and we had 150 Turkers or 150 crowd workers participate in this experiment. And there were 3 conditions. I'm not going to talk about the first one because we didn't really get any responses to that. Yeah, I'll wrap up. And these were the 2 conditions. The last one is the one where the planner was present. In this, the planner was doing only basic constraint checking. And I just want you to look at some of these plans. So this was the exact same problem description. It's just that there was the planner involved in generating sub-goals in one, and it wasn't in the other. So there are more detailed plans that come up. And similarly, there are also more numbers of responses when the planner is deployed. And there's also more critiques that are generated when the planner is actually being used. So the planner suggested 45 critiques as against the crowd suggesting just 8. And 7 of the critiques suggested by the planner were actually solved, whereas none suggested by the humans were actually even looked at by the other Turkers. And of course, we didn't bias them, we just put them all together in one place. So there's no way for the next Turker to tell whether a critique was generated by the planner or by a human. And this work has actually, it's received a lot of attention. People have been happy to play with the system. We demoed this at iCAPS, which was last month. It's the planning conference, and it actually won the best demo award after we demoed it. I think part of it may have to do with the fact that we put it online. Let me see if I can find this. Yeah, we actually put it online. This is a travel plan for the city of Portsmouth in New Hampshire, which is where iCAPS was. So this is a schedule that we generated crowdsourced from the attendees at iCAPS. So I think they were happy enough to vote for it after that. But anyway, so it's been people have been happy to play with the system. So yeah, anyway, this is a summary of what I talked about today. We will have a poster near the iaaai posters today. So if you want to talk about this further, I will be there, Tathagata will be there, Rao will probably be there for some time. So please come by and talk to us, and thank you.
So does it automatically generate to-do tags based on the hashtags that people put in the text box?
Right, so one of the things that I couldn't go into details about was we have, we basically do some standard text extraction, and then we do matching. So if you had synonyms of visit, for example, then it would identify that that action has something to do with visiting, and then it would just pop up the sub-goals related with that. So yes, it does that automatically. Yeah. Yes.
How do you handle ordering? Is that something that comes from the crowd?
Learning?
Ordering.
Oh, ordering.
Ordering.
Right. So there are some initial constraints that may come from your requester himself or herself, right? So the requester may say things like, I would like to do, so we give them the facility to say things like, I would like to do lunch before I go to museums and things like that. Even if that doesn't come in, we let the crowd enter that information. So that's the main source of that information, that the crowd can come in and critique it. But you can also add some common sense rules, which we did, to the ASP solver. So common sense rules are of the nature of breakfast must always be before lunch, and lunch must be before dinner. But I mean, you can't make it too sort of, you can't engineer too much knowledge in there, so we just left that. But we found that the crowd workers were actually very amenable to adding these kinds of rules, because these are things that occur to humans immediately. If they see like a misordered pair, so if they see breakfast being ordered after lunch in the current suggestions, they immediately put in that suggestion. And that's easy for them because they get paid 10 cents for putting that in. But it's invaluable for our system because we now have that rule that breakfast should be before lunch. So yeah, that's.
Thank you. Close the session, and this is also the innovative
I will do this.
applications
Yeah.
conference.